There's no such thing as a sexual relationship. Insurrections. Critical studies in religion, politics, and culture. Introduction to Alain Badiou and Barbara Cassin, There's no such thing as a sexual relationship. 2 lessons on Lacan. The writings of Jacques Lacan are notorious for their extreme difficulty, but no text of his has elicited as much frustration as his 1972 essay Le THIRD-WORLDISM. When Lacan gave the piece to Charles Melman for publication in Silicet, the official journal of Lacan's school at the time, the École Freudienne de Paris, Melman returned it to him saying it was an absolutely unreadable, impossible text, no one would ever understand anything in it. One Le THIRD-WORLDISM was in fact published in Silicet 4 in 1973 and republished in 2001 in Lacan's Autre Écrit, but it has retained its reputation as Lacan's most densely written and intransigent if not fully unreadable text. There have been 3 impressive unauthorized attempts to translate it into English that I am aware of, but all of them come up against the fact that much of Lacan's essay consists of more or less untranslatable puns and neologisms, obscure references, and ambiguous grammar. Melman devoted an entire year of his seminar at the École Freudienne to reading Le THIRD-WORLDISM, as did Cormac Gallagher at the Irish School for Lacanian Psychoanalysis. 3. The Belgian psychoanalyst Christian Feierens has published almost 500 pages on Le THIRD-WORLDISM, which is itself less than 50 pages long, in 2 books, Lecture de l'étourdite 2002 and Le discours psychanalytique un deuxième lecture de l'étourdite de Lacan 2012. But the question that opens Feierens's first book, is it readable, remains a real problem, beginning with the title itself of Lacan's essay. The French word étourdi means something like scatterbrain or absent-minded, and Richard Wilbur translated Molière's 1653 play L'Étourdi as the bungler. The title of Lacan's essay, however, is Le THIRD-WORLDISM, with a silent final T, which is ungrammatical and puzzling for a French reader and lends itself to various homonymic interpretations. For rather than trying to translate the term which only appears once in Lacan's essay, other than as the title, Susan Spitzer and I have decided to leave it as it is, a proper noun in all its dazzling incomprehensibility. Lacan dates Le THIRD-WORLDISM at July 14, 1972, which places it immediately after his 1971-72 seminar, Upire, and just prior to his famous 1972-73 seminar, Encore, in the midst of a remarkably productive late phase of his thinking, roughly from 1968 to 1978, when, as he himself states, he articulated some of his most important ideas, including his theory of the 4 discourses: master, university, hysteric, analyst, his account of the real as the non-existence of a sexual rapport or relationship, and his formulas of sexuation. 5. Le THIRD-WORLDISM can be seen as a condensation or palimpsest of the ideas, diagrams, and linguistic inventions that emerge in these seminars, and there is no question that familiarity with them helps illuminate the navel-like density of the essay. 6. Both Alain Badiou and Barbara Cassin have long histories of profound engagement with Lacan's thinking. Badiou, who has frequently named Lacan as one of his principal masters, devoted a year of his semi-nar 1994-95 to Lacan and anaphilosophy. 7. Already in the late 1960s, Badiou published 2 essays in the important Lacanian Althuserian journal Cahiers pour l'analyse, and a small book originally a presentation in Althusser's seminar that involves Lacanian issues, the concept of model. 8. Badiou's first major book of philosophy, Theory of the Subject 1982, includes an extended close reading of Lacan's early essay Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty, and is composed in the style of a Lacanian seminar. Badiou's great work, being at Event 1988, is framed by references to Lacan and concludes with an important discussion of Lacan and Descartes. And, in Badiou's words, Lacan has a strategic position in its sequel, Logics of Worlds 2006. Barbara Cassin has written a remarkable book, Jacques le Sophiste Lacan, Logos et Psychanalyse, since this volume with Badiou appeared, in which she elaborates several of the ideas here and expands her account of Lacan's anti-Aristotelian sophistry. Cassin's most important book to date is the magisterial L'Effet Sophistique, an extraordinary history and theory of sophistry and its post-classical afterlife, including illuminating discussions of Lacan. 9. Her relationship with Lacan was also personal. In Jacques le Sophiste she describes a series of meetings she had with Lacan in the 1970s, at his request, to discuss the concept of doxography, the study of the traces of earlier philosophers' ideas reported by later philosophers, hence touching on the question of the possibility of integral transmission of knowledge, a topic of growing interest to Lacan in the 70s. 10. And even though Badiou and Cassin approach Lacan from quite different perspectives, he is a philosopher, she is a logologist and classicist, they agree that Le THIRD-WORLDISM is an exceptionally important and nodal text and key to conceptualizations of their own projects. Badiou and Cassin's essays appear here under the title There is no such thing as a sexual relationship il and n'y a pas de rapport sexuel, the enigmatic utterance that can be taken as the motto of Lacan's later thinking, appearing 5 times in Les THIRD-WORLDISM, and nearly 70 times in his seminars from the 1970s. Of course, we should not understand it as the claim that people don't have sex, which would be absurd. 11 Rather than a statement about sexuality or sexual practices, the lack, absence, or impossibility of a sexual relationship, all forms in which Lacan expresses the modes of non-existence claimed by il and n'y a pas constitute something like the transcendental conditions of what Lacan calls sexuation. As a corollary to Lacan's only slightly less paradoxical statement, a signifier represents a subject for another signifier. It implies that the subject affected by this linkage of 2 signifiers is constituted as such according to one of 2 possible configurations conventionally named man and woman, which involve 2 different modes of limited access to jouissance. Both men and women are castrated, according to Lacan, that is, alienated from their bodies by language, which gives them access to a larger symbolic order at the expense of any direct, unmediated experience of bodily jouissance. To enter into subjectivity as a speaking being parlor is to be deprived of the full corporality of animal existence, whether or not there ever was such a thing. A subject's experience of sexuality, then, is constellated around the little bit of jouissance that is left over from its cancellation as it obtrudes into and distorts the networks of signification. But there are at least 2 modes of castration, 2 ways in which language configures a subject and provides some access to residual jouissance, and those 2 modes are asymmetrical and incommensurate with each other, not reciprocal or complementary, hence no direct relationship between them is possible. It should go without saying that for Lacan these 2 sexual positions have nothing to do with biological gender. A woman can inhabit a male body and a man can just as easily inhabit the body of a female. Nor do they have anything to do with object choice, homosexual or heterosexual. The lack of a sexual relationship can be understood first of all in the sense that whereas men relate to women primarily as objects, rather than subjects, the objet or partial object of fantasy, women relate to men as bearers of the phallus, the signifier of both castration and its imaginary suspension. 12 In these terms, a sexual relationship is a non-relationship, since men and women address each other through the cloak of fantasy, and each from a different locus from which the other addresses him or her. Neither men nor women encounter the other as a subject per se, hence there can be no intersubjective relationship between them. Lacan's primary account of the lack of a sexual relationship, however, involves the incommensurability of the logics that operate in man and women's sexuation, both of which are formulated in terms of the universal and necessary castrating effects of the phallus. But the expression of the logic of castration is different for each. Whereas all men are castrated, according to Lacan, there is no woman who is not castrated. 13 In classical Aristotelian logic, these formulations are equivalent, but in intuitionistic logic, which Lacan frequently aligns himself with, the principle of double negative elimination does not hold. 14 Moreover, each statement involves a sort of exception, which is stated again in a distinct formulation. According to Lacan, men are able to support the phallic function of castration only insofar as there is someone who, they imagine, is uncastrated and enjoys without limit. Hence a subject is determined as a man not just by the phallic function of castration, which afflicts both men and women, but by the unconscious assumption of this mythical all-enjoying exceptional man who says no to castration. 15 The formulas of the woman's sexuation also involve a universal rule and something like an exception to that rule. If, however, a particular man is defined by means of a universal category man that applies for all poor to men, as Lacan writes in Les THIRD-WORLDISM, a woman is constituted as such in relation to a not all paced out. 16 That is, the sexuation of a man is universal insofar as the logic that determines a particular man also applies to man as a totality, whereas a woman is inscribed as not all insofar as the logic that determines her sexuation does not apply to all women at totality. According to Lacan, that does not exist, without, however, excluding any particular women from that logic. 17 Although there are important differences in their modes of access to jouissance, the phallic function conceals the constitutive lack of a sexual relationship from both men and women. In Les THIRD-WORLDISM, Lacan explains that this fundamental inscription of both sexes in the symbolic order as castrated is precisely for the sake of shielding them from the trauma of the real. The fact that there is no sexual relationship between them, all subjects as such, are inscribed in the phallic function to avoid the absence of the sexual relationship tout sujet en tant que tel. S'inscrit dans la fonction phallique pour par l'absence du rapport sexuel A 458. This clarifies Lacan's argument, which is not that there are men and women although they don't have a relationship, but rather the converse. There is no such thing as a sexual relationship, and, as a response to that real impossibility, there are men and women. Another way to understand Lacan's assertion that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship is as the claim that a relationship of men and women cannot be written or formalized, which is to say that no adequate symbolic articulation of the sexual encounter is possible. This is the argument that the human animal, as parliter, struggles to make sense of sexuality, to put it into words and images, but can never succeed in that effort at representation, insofar as its constitution as a subject of language is precisely what prevents it from inhabiting its sexuality as an immediate experience. Language is the parliter's bargain with the devil in order to gain access to the symbolic order and the worlds of culture that language makes available. The speaking being gives up any possibility of full access to jouissance, which persists only in the highly attenuated and mediating form of the phallus. Whatever other jouissance the human animal might have experienced is excluded by the phallic signifier that constitutes it as a speaking being. Hence the one thing that language categorically cannot signify is any jouissance other than phallic jouissance. To paraphrase Hegel, the mystery of human sexuality is a mystery to human beings themselves. This concept of the impossibility of a sexual relationship comes to define Lacan's developing concept of the real. If in his earlier work Lacan understood the real first as the facts of personal history, then in terms of what Freud called psychic reality, which attempts to represent and reconcile internal and external effect, already in the late 50s Lacan associates the real with the impossibility of any such reconciliation, as a topographically indeterminate stimulus that is traumatically in excess of symbolization. In Upire, Lacan remarks it is in the very practice of the sexual relationship that there is affirmed the bond lien of the impossible and the real that we promote, we as speaking beings. There is no other attestation of the real. What we have to be suspicious of in all reality is that it might be phantasmatic. And what allows us to escape from the fantasy of reality is an impossibility in the symbolic formula that we are able to extract from it, which demonstrates there the real opus 173-74. Our experience of reality is intrinsically untrustworthy, prone to all manner of distortion, not only because the specular constitution of the ego installs us within an imaginary order of false resemblance and coherence, but because what we take as reality is based on the fundamental fantasy that shields us from the lack in the symbolic order. Hence if we are to encounter the real, it will not be by debunking reality as an imaginary construct or ideological in the sense of a false image, but by facing the inconsistency of the symbolic order, the impossibility, finally, of formalizing the sexual relationship. And this suggests one way of understanding the title of Lacan's seminar of 1971-72. The ellipses in Upire mark the place of the lack of the sexual relationship, which we can either encounter head-on or face something worse that results from the delusion that authentic intersubjective relationship is attainable. If our entry into language is at the expense of the bulk of our jouissance, leaving us the mere residue of phallic jouissance along with a woman's possibility of a supplementary jouissance that, as non-phallic, also cannot be symbolized, hence nothing of substance can be said about it, it is clear that anything other than the phallic in our sexual experience cannot be symbolized. Moreover, as Lacan writes in Encore, the possibility of symbolic inscription, of writing as such, depends precisely on the impossibility of formalizing the sexual relationship. Everything written stems from the fact that it will forever be impossible to write, as such, the sexual relationship. It is on that basis that there is a certain effect of discourse, which is called writing. 18. Every discourse, from that of the master to those of the university, the hysteric, and the analyst, is inscribed in mathems that hold without filling the empty place of the sexual relationship. In THIRD-WORLDISM, Lacan explores various implications of these ideas, suggesting, for example, that the subject man or woman that emerges through this impasse in signification, as a dissimulation of the impossibility of the sexual relationship, is itself a particular response of the real, a particular way in which this impossibility configures itself. The subject, as an effect of signification, is a response of the real le sujet, comme fait de signification, est réponse du réel a 459. 19. THIRD-WORLDISM is situated in the psychotopology opened up by this account of the real as the impossibility of a sexual relationship. For Barbara Cassin, Lacan's THIRD-WORLDISM is the only text that avoids Aristotelianism, or at any rate the only one among all contemporary texts that gives itself the best chance of avoiding it. In this case, Aristotelianism means the axiomatic construction of logic on the basis of the principle of non-contradiction, which asserts that X and not X cannot be true of the same thing in the same way at the same time, or, in Aristotle's terms, the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect. 20. Cassin demonstrated in her book written with Michel Narcy, La décision du sens, a translation and commentary on Book Gamma of Aristotle's Metaphysics, that, for Aristotle, before this is the case for things, it is an assumption necessary to language. Language use depends on the stability of words. The individuals in a social group must use words in the same way, with the same intentions, for this is precisely what distinguishes the human being as a rational animal, zoon logonikon. For Aristotle, this is much more than an academic argument, insofar as he must contend with the disturbing claims of the free-ranging sophists who blithely ignored and even parodied such linguistic strictures, celebrating language, in Gorgias's expression, as a powerful pharmacon that can act as either a poison or a cure or both, in the hands of a skilled rhetorical practitioner. Aristotle extends this assumption of linguistic consistency into an epistemologically consistent logic that he then projects onto things themselves, which are thereby granted ontological consistency. This is an incontrovertible assertion, as Cassin points out, since to object to it requires the use of speech and thus to participate in a shared linguistic community, which is implicitly based on the belief that words remain stable enough to vouchsafe intersubjective communication. Just as, in Plato's Republic, Socrates could not fully refute the sophist Thrasymachus, but finally was forced to silence him by, so to speak, beating him with his own rhetorical stick, so Aristotle combats the threat of sophistry with a kind of sophistic trixophistrix, one that precludes all objections by calling the one who does not accept his decision of meaning a mere plant. 21. If Lacan's THIRD avoids Aristotelianism, it cannot be by adopting an anti-Aristotelian posture, but, as Cassin writes, by means of an post, or ab-Aristotelianism, that is, not by merely objecting to the principle of non-contradiction, but by proposing a certain subtraction from or addition to it, one that leaves its fundamental assumption more or less intact, although confined to a specific range of mental functions. For the conscious mind functions according to Aristotelian principles. It assumes its own consistency and the consistency of others, but the unconscious is another matter, indeed another place, eine andere Schauplatz. In the first phase of his psychoanalytic work on dreams, jokes, and parapraxis, Freud discovered that the unconscious tolerates and even depends on contradiction as a way of both interdicting a thought and allowing it to be surreptitiously spoken at the same time. Moreover, our attachments are fundamentally ambivalent. We cannot fully separate objects in terms of love and hate, hence our unconscious ideas and their verbal and somatic expressions are riven by ambiguity. When the unconscious erupts into conscious experience, we speak, misspeak, and unspeak in the same breath. For Cassin, Lacan's THIRD explores the efflorescence of these unconscious formations in discourse, and does so by passing, as she puts it, from Aristotle back to the pre-Socratic atomist Democritus. In Democritus, Lacan finds an ally in his attempt to supplement Aristotle's foundational logical principle that there's no such thing as contradiction, as Cassin reformulates it with the psychoanalytic declaration that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. Aristotle and much of the philosophic tradition thereafter assume that a key function of the principle of non-contradiction is the separation of meaning from nonsense, or in Lacan's terms, sense from nonsense, a distinction the sophists violated with gleeful abandon. For the sophists, the line dividing true and false, black and white, was intrinsically blurred, and they discovered in that ambiguity 1,000 shades of linguistic gray that could be exploited for rhetorical effect and political intervention, for personal gain or the public weal. But the negation of sense by nonsense depends on and finally re-establishes the primacy of sense. A linguistic act can only seem nonsensical insofar as it functions within a particular logical context, such as the Aristotelian decision on meaning. Hence Lacan introduces a third category in THIRD, in excess of the sense/nonsense opposition absence, a term that will be central for both Cassin's and Badiou's readings of the essay. 22. For Cassin, psychoanalysis retrieves and reintroduces a concept of absence that was already implicit in Democritus and other pre-Socratic philosophers, a concept that Aristotle had obscured with the principle of non-contradiction. Lacan's claim that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship articulates a principle of absence that is irreducible to the sense/nonsense opposition. If, as Cassin writes, Aristotle's account of meaning is based on an inside/boundary/outside topology, Lacan's logic of absence implies something stranger, perhaps less intuitive, according to Cassin, a far more complicated, Mobius and torus-shaped topology. To return to the formulas of sexuation, which are never far from Cassin's mind here, we might suggest that Aristotle's logic assumes the same closed topology implicit in the logic of man's sexuation. The interiority of the set of all men is both established and limited by the claim that there is something external to it, something that would not be a man, namely, a plant. The Mobius strip and the torus are two topological models that Lacan frequently uses in his later seminars to describe the structures of subjectivity, structures that do not operate according to the assumptions about space that orient Euclidean geometry. The Mobius strip violates the recto/verso opposition by having only one side, and the torus warps the inside/outside opposition by having a void in its middle, an outside in its inside, exemplifying what Lacan calls the extimite of the subject's relationship to the objet, the bit of exteriority in its most interior and intimate space. The logic of a woman's sexuation will orient the domain of absence, which has neither a self-identical interiority nor a limiting exteriority. As a principle of neither sense nor nonsense, absence operates according to the intuitionistic logic that proposes that the contradiction of the positive universal, the not all, IXFX, does not imply the existence of a particular negative EXFX, as it must according to the propositional form of the principle of non-contradiction. There is no woman who avoids castration, but women cannot be totalized as a set of all women, hence every woman means something very different from all men insofar as what applies to each woman castration also applies to every woman, but not to some hypothetical closed set of all women, which does not exist. Against the univocity of meaning that establishes Aristotelian logic and ontology on a well-regulated set of linguistic conventions and the clear distinction between sense and nonsense, Lacan's absence involves a principle of equivocity that may seem in comparison like mere absent-mindedness or étourdissement. 23. Cassin discusses two sets of implications of Lacan's claim that the sexual relationship cannot be symbolized by the speaking being because its habitation of language is at the expense of jouissance. First, there are clinical implications. The language we speak holds the place of the lack of a sexual relationship. It operates within the dialectic of sense and nonsense and writes itself on our bodies in various symptomatic formations. For one thing, knowing this helps the analyst avoid supporting the analysand's defenses against the sexual non-relationship, such as the wish for a perfect match. Moreover, his or her knowledge of the non-existence of the sexual relationship has direct implications for how the analyst uses language. Rather than using a propositional language based on the logic of non-contradiction and the dialectic of sense and nonsense, the analyst uses apophantic language, language that directly shows and intervenes rather than telling or proposing. This is a crucial distinction that Lacan presents numerous times in Les THIRD and the seminars of this period in terms of the difference between the saying le dire, the act of speaking in its irreducible materiality, and the said le dit, the meaning that is derived from it. The other implication of the non-existence of the sexual relationship, however, becomes the real focus of Cassin's essay and indicates a path leading back to Democritus and what Lacan calls his joke. Lacan writes in Les THIRD that Democritus, in effect, gave us the gift of the atomos, of the radical real, by eliding the not, me, from it, as a result of which the den was indeed the stowaway, the clandestine passenger whose clam now controls our destiny. 24. Democrat en effet nous fit cadeau de l'atomos, du rail radical, en el de la pas, me. Moyen en quoi la den fout bien le passage éclat d'estat dont la clam fait maintenant notre destinée. 494. At stake is Democritus's use in fragment 156 of a word, den, that does not appear in any of the standard dictionaries of ancient Greek. In the phrase translated to be no more body den than void meton, den is taken to mean body insofar as the particle of negation me seems to be added to it to produce void meton. The problem, both philological and philosophical, is that meton is not derived in this way, as a negation of den, but comes from a modification of hen, meaning one, hence meton, according to proper Greek, sound etymology comes from mead hen, not one. Moreover, as Cassin points out, there are two forms of negation in Greek. U and miu is factual negation, or what we might call existential negation. It implies that in this case it is not so, but it could be otherwise. Me, on the other hand, is a modal negation, implying categorical impossibility. So, Cassin writes, meton indicates something that cannot and must not be. This does not get us any closer to den, however, at least not from an etymological perspective. For, as Cassin writes, den is the product of a false cut, anomalous when compared with the etymology inscribed in words. It is something of a sign signifier, a deliberate fabrication, the mark of a difference. We are reminded of Lacan's frequent coinages made by just such false cuts, including dit mention, which introduces a non-etymologically justified cut in dimension in order to bring out dit said in mention, which among other things suggests the verb mentir, to lodge. In general, the idea of nothing is produced in language by negating an entity, a thing nothing, or, as in the French word rien nothing, which, Cassin points out, derives from the Latin for thing rem, simply morphing into its opposite. But as we have said, this is not the case for meton and den. This is why den becomes a name, as Lacan claims, for the radical real. If it is an atom, it is neither something positive nor something negative, but, as Cassin writes, the atom is literally less than nothing. Den. Ot 1 25 is the name of the atom insofar as it can no longer be confused with the being of ontology or be regarded as an elementary body in physics. The key point here for Cassin is that if Den is the elementary particle for Democritus, it is not a way of founding the one, that is, it can't be understood as the smallest or simplest unit of raw matter understood either as a positivity, a kind of stuff, or as a negativity, the void is intrinsically self-different. Hence, for Lacan, the Den is a stowaway in the history of ontology, a bit of the real concealed in the foundation of atomic theory and irreducible to Aristotelian logic or categories, and, for Cassin, it is a rhetorical excess that cannot be reduced to classical logic. The Den is a discursive element that is taken as the proper object of physics, and as such it is a joke at the expense of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. As Cassin writes, if we somehow manage to think the real of the principle, there is no such thing as a sexual relationship in terms rendered illegible by Aristotle of the stowaway, the Den, the stowaway of all ontology, it may actually turn out to be pretty funny. For Cassin, this puts Lacan on the side of the sophists, insofar as they both resist Aristotle's assumption that the logic of non-contradiction is the foundation of logos as speech and reason, his claim that to speak is by definition to make sense, to mean something rather than something else, something that means the same thing for someone else, which is the signifying function Lacan reserves for a certain linguistic element called the sign. Both the sophists and Lacan insist that there is more and less to language than this, as Lacan insists, the phallus, as the signifier of castration and the condition of any subject whatsoever, always involves jouissance. To be a subject, represented by one idiosyncratic and petrified signifier for the rest of the symbolic order, is to enjoy language just as much as to suffer the castrating effects it brings with it. Cassin calls the approach to language that embodies this experience of its effective and performative function logology, borrowing a term from Novalis, who labeled two parts of his philosophical notebooks from 1798 logological fragments. In Jacques Le Sophiste, Cassin cites a passage from Novalis's notebooks that expresses her sense of logology. Language is such a marvelous and fruitful secret because when someone speaks merely for the sake of speaking, he utters the most splendid, most original truths. But if he wants to speak about something definite, capricious language makes him say the most ridiculous and confused stuff. This is also the cause of the hatred that so many serious people feel toward language. They notice its mischief, but not the fact that the chattering they scorn is the infinitely serious aspect of language. 26. For Novalis, philosophy must aspire to logology, which involves the realization that language says something true only when one speaks merely for the sake of speaking, for the pleasure of speaking, rather than to signify something in particular, which leads to misunderstanding and confusion. For Cassin, logology is the moment when discourse is understood, first of all, in relation to itself and, in more Lacanian terms, language la langue in relation to la langue. 27 La langue is Lacan's coinage made by collapsing the article la and the noun langue, language, or, more literally, tongue, and refers to speech as purely sonic chatter, the language the unconscious speaks and hears. Speech is rife with jouissance. According to Aristotle, the sophists argue for the sake of argument, rather than from any conviction or for any goal, deriving pleasure from something in the sound of their own voices and words. 28 And, for Cassin, it is precisely in these terms that we must read Lacan's Le THIRD. Not reading as a process of winnowing away of nonsense to get at whatever kernel of sense remains, but precisely reading for the absence that opens only from refusing to dissimulate the impossibility of the sexual relationship. Alain Badiou's friendly but profound disagreement with Barbara Cassin on Lacan's Le THIRD involves, first of all, the question of the status of ambiguity or equivocation in Lacan. For Badiou, Cassin's reading is an especially finely articulated version of the thesis that for Lacan the signifier is irreducibly polyvalent and its interpretation intrinsically interminable, a thesis that we could call, loosely speaking, deconstructive in its resistance to univocal determination. Badiou argues that for Cassin, this makes Lacan an enemy of the univocity of being as well as meaning and, in this sense, an anaphilosopher or at least anti-Aristotelian in his refusal of ontology. For Badiou, however, Lacan's use of mathemes and his notion of formalization constitute an objection to this account of Lacan's understanding and practice of linguistic ambiguity. If Lacan is an anaphilosopher, he is not a logologist, Badiou argues, insofar as his critique of meaning is not for the sake of championing ambiguity or undecidability, but, on the contrary, is intended to elaborate a mode of knowledge that can be formalized and transmitted without loss in a word, knowledge that is unequivocal. For Badiou, Lacan's ana-philosophical critique of meaning is in itself a fundamentally philosophical move for. What is philosophy if not the love of truth, in some distinction from knowledge and its inevitable relativism and perspectivism? Nevertheless, for Badiou, Lacan is an ana-philosopher insofar as his attack on meaning is not in the name of truth, which Lacan consistently refers to as a half-saying, dire, intrinsically fragmentary, but a certain kind of knowledge and rather than, strictly speaking, of the real. This knowledge is not ambiguous, since, according to Lacan, it can be transmitted without loss, without the slippages of the signifier that characterize the production of meaning. Badiou's essay opens by addressing the two senses of formula in his title The Formulas of THIRD. At first, formula as a knowledge fully transmissible as what Lacan calls his mathems, the letters, symbols, and diagrams that make up the formulas of sexuation that he introduced in the 1970s and that already litter his texts and seminars from the mid-1950s. 29 The other sense of formula in his title, Badiou tells us, involves a subject's existence and derives from a line in Rimbaud's prose poem Vagabonds. In the final passage of the poem, the poet dreams of his brother and strives to take him back to his primal state, a son of the sun, le rendra son état primitif de fils du soleil, for which he seeks an originary ground and formula. I, impatient to find the place in the formula, moi pressé de trouver le et la formule. 30 In this context, as Badiou indicates, formula suggests something like the expression of an unconscious or primal experience of being as well as the subjective effect associated with the urge to rediscover it. 31 In his book The Century, Badiou connects this sense of formula in Rimbaud with André Breton's phrase in Arcanum 17, only a magic formula can be effective here, in which Badiou understands formula as a nominal distillate of the power of a creative act. According to Badiou, formula indicates this slightest point of attachment to the real of that which announces its novelty, whereby one word alone, is the same as a body. This act of fusing word and body is exemplary of the art of the 20th century, which aimed to conjoin the present, the real intensity of life, and the name of this present is given in the Formula 147. Thus this second sense of formula refers to a subjective act of nomination that embodies the immediacy of life itself. So how can these two notions of formula, mathem and act, be thought together? As Badiou writes, how can a formula be at one and the same time in the register of the mathem and in that of a subject's existence? And how, Badiou asks, does Lacan move from his well-known elaborations of the vicissitudes of the signifier, the endless phonetic and semantic ambiguities and slippages that characterize the unconscious, to formulas, understood as unambiguous and completely transmissible, without noise or remainder, mathems that demonstrate that an analytic act has taken place? For Badiou, these questions are bound up with his ongoing investigation of the relationship of psychoanalysis to philosophy. Badiou argues that, like all of the figures he calls ana-philosophers including Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein, Lacan tries to show philosophy something, an exceptional object, that it cannot otherwise think, by means of what Cassin calls the apophantic language of analysis. For Lacan, what psychoanalysis shows philosophy is first of all the real, and in THIRD, we recall, the real is defined as absence, the absence or impossibility of the sexual relationship. 32 Absence is the absence of sense, but not nonsense, which is merely the opposite of sense. In the formula that Badiou cites as key to THIRD, Lacan writes absence denotes sex, absex sense l'absence design le sexe, sense absex. Absex sense is the formula that emerges from the absence of a sexual relationship, from the fact that sex has no meaning beyond itself, that there is no representational distance that would be adequate to it precisely insofar as representation itself is based on draining off of the real of sex, its reduction to phallic signification. Badiou argues that Lacan's project in THIRD is to establish the difference between the discourses of psychoanalysis and philosophy, which operates, according to Lacan, within what he calls the master's discourse in order to show philosophy the real that it can't see the impossibility of a sexual relationship. THIRD is a disjunctive proposition distinguishing between the discourse of analysis and the discourse of philosophy on the basis of two entirely different ways of constructing the truth/knowledge/real triad, a triad that is in fact common to both discourses. Badiou points out that Lacan's critique is aimed at what he sees as philosophy's attempt to link truth, knowledge, and the real by breaking their essential triplicity and fusing them into pairs. There is knowledge of truth and truth of the real. According to Lacan, philosophy claims that there is a truth adequate to the real, hence that truth is meaningful for psychoanalysis. On the contrary, there is no truth of the real, which is a meaningless formulation. However, Lacan argues that there is a kind of psychoanalytic knowledge that pertains to or is in rather than of the real, not knowledge in the sense of a particular meaning, but a kind of knowledge whose condition is the absence of meaning, the absence of a sexual relationship that constitutes the real. The psychoanalytic critique of philosophy thus is for the sake of demonstrating the real of abstract sense that philosophy cannot accommodate, that exceeds the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction that divides the world of meaning into sense and nonsense. According to Badiou, Lacan's critique of philosophy for reducing the relationship of truth, knowledge, and the real into hypostatic pairs amounts to the claim that the one is. For Badiou, Lacan's frequent statement around the time of Leitarded that there is something of the one il y a Elon, often compressed as Yodlin, must be taken as a repudiation of the assertion of the being of the one and the oneness of being, and the difference between these two statements constitutes the crucial point of decision that marks the origin of philosophy. As Badiou points out at the very beginning of Being and Event, the great ontological decision is between the irreducible multiplicity of being, on the one hand, and the unity of being, on the other. To decide, as Badiou does, for multiplicity is not to dispute that there is a function of one indeed, to count as one is a fundamental operation of set theory and a regular procedure of thinking, but to conceive of it this way is a radical subversion of the speculative, or philosophical, thesis the one is. According to Badiou, Lacan understands the relationship of truth, knowledge, and the real as a kind of Borromean nut that depends upon the co-presence of all three, but is held together only by means of an act, the analytic act, which is neither knowledge nor truth but the demonstration of the real. The act emerges in the analytic pass that marks the conclusion of an analysis, both as the sign that something has happened, something has changed in the subjective constellation, and as the happening itself, the event of subjective transformation. This is the point of confluence of the matheme and the act, the convergence of the two senses of formula in the title of Badiou's essay. For Badiou, of course, Lacan's claim that philosophy necessarily or invariably decides that the one is not true. Philosophy must decide, but its decision is not forced. It can indeed decide against the primacy of the one, as Badiou and other contemporary philosophers do. Lacan's ana-philosophical position does not, however, place him simply outside philosophy, as is the case with all ana-philosophers. Lacan's attempt to demonstrate an exterior to philosophy depends upon the categories of philosophy. Absence must be understood as exceeding the dialectic of sense and nonsense. The real can only be the decompletion of the totality of the symbolic and the imaginary. And just as much as ana-philosophy depends upon philosophy, so the philosopher must confront the enigmas and paradoxes presented to it by ana-philosophy, and, first of all, as Badiou insists, it must traverse the ana-philosophy of Lacan. The essays in this book constitute a moment in an ongoing conversation between Badiou and Cassin, both of whom have much more to say about Lacan elsewhere, in works implicitly or sometimes explicitly addressed to each other. The reader may protest that the absent elephant in the room here is of course Lacan's extraordinary, unreadable, fascinating text itself, Leitarded, which merely in being touched or brushed against emits such sparks of light and heat. Is it translatable? Maybe. Is it readable? Of course. But perhaps only in its absence. Of all Lacan's texts, Leitarded, originally published in 1973 in the fourth issue of the journal Silicite and reprinted in 2001 by Édition du Seuil in the volume Autre Écrit, one is generally considered to be one of his most impenetrable, which is saying a lot when you know its author's long-standing reputation for having a convoluted, gonghoristic style. The reason for this is that Leitarded brings together many of the most important, but also the most difficult, or paradoxical, aspects of Lacan's thought, taking its definitive form in the early 1970s. It should be recalled that his seminar of the academic year 1972-73, entitled Encore, 2 is the one in which the doctrines and formulas that assured Lacan's success can be found in abundance. The theory of the four discourses, the master, the hysteric, the university, and the analyst. Love makes up for the lack of a sexual relationship. Woman does not exist. Language is knowledge's harebrained lucubration about la langue, and so on. All these topics and a few others as well can be found in highly condensed form in Leitarded. So there is no intention here of providing an exhaustive commentary on the text or even of adding to the innumerable interpretations that have grown up around it for the past 25 years. 3. Instead, in this short book, we want to propose something completely different, thinking with the text, thinking through it, using incisions and extractions, about questions that are close to our hearts. For Barbara Cassin, this means the questions of language and the critique of ontology in their constitutive, sex relationship with writing. For Alain Badiou, it means the question of the uneasy relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy. In both cases, as we shall see, a threedom relationship is involved: language, sex, and fiction, in one case, for truth, sex, and knowledge in the other. What is at stake in these two studies, or readings, or openings, one by a woman and the other by a man? An important point, is indeed knowledge, considered by one of us in terms of its intimate connection with matters of language and by the other in terms of what philosophy purports to say about truth. So, with regard to Lacan's THIRD, to the modern theory of sexuation, and to the paradoxes of language and the unconscious, the male philosopher, at any rate, can say that what we are dealing with here is a new confrontation between, or a new distribution of, the masculinity of Plato and the femininity of sophistics. The psychoanalyst is the presence of the sophist in our time, but with a different status. Lacan, Le Séminaire. Livre 12 Problèmes cruciaux pour la psychanalyse, Crucial Problems for Psychoanalysis, session of May 12, 1965. Hionapat Lacan, Le Séminaire. Livre 19, ou pire, or worse, session of December 15, 1971. Come on, then, and may heaven bless us with children of whom we shall be the fathers. Molière, The Blunder Relatoire, Act 5, Scene 11. THIRD, a text in French, or even in hyper or meta-French, that adopts a position on speech, interpretation, and meaning is, to my mind, the only text that avoids Aristotelianism or, at any rate, the only one among all contemporary texts that gives itself the best chance of avoiding it. This is the case not because it is anti-Aristotelian, which wouldn't make the slightest difference, since, so to speak, a torpedo boat destroyer is first and foremost a torpedo boat, but because it is adamantly an Aristotelian, post-Aristotelian, and, to be absolutely precise, ab-Aristotelian. It is the text that escapes, from on interpretation and book gamma of the metaphysics. Lacan, from A as in Aristotle to D as in Democritus. A is in Aristotle because Aristotle is Lacan's staple philosophical fare and is also his staple philosophical fare in this philosophically unreadable text, THIRD. The first indication of this is that the name Aristotle surrounds the heart of THIRD, i.e., what the Sphinx says, which is the only passage in quotation marks and the only one in which the word étourdi, after its use in the title, appears. Not that I understand the sentences, but the name Aristotle, which crops up everywhere, can be seen just before the riddle of the note all la paste out, which should be taken not in the sense that, by reducing our quantifiers to Aristotle's reading of them, would make the exists non existent equivalent to the nonius nullness of his universal negative, would bring back the me panties, the note all which he was nevertheless able to formulate, by testifying to the existence of a subject that says no to the phallic function, and does so, by assuming it from the so-called opposition between two particulars 22-465. And the name comes back, shortly after the Pythian Sphinx has expressed her satisfaction. You have satisfied me, little man, when Lacan speaks. It pleased me to note that Aristotle failed, oddly enough, to provide us with the terms that I'm borrowing from a different amusement. Wouldn't it have been interesting, though, if he had oriented his world of the note all to the point of negating its universality? Existence would thus no longer wither away as a result of particularity, and for Alexander, his master, the warning might have been worthwhile if it's on account of an absence like no other compound by which the universe would be negated that the nodal that exists slips away. He would have been the very first a serendipitous term here to laugh at his plan to make an empire of the whole world l'univers. 225-469. Aristotle appears between the universal and laughter here, with a hypothesized absence. Aristotle is Lacan's other, the other of the Lacan of THIRD, who may well drop, in due course, like fly droppings. D, as in Democritus, since Democritus is the culmination of THIRD, its grand finale, with the joke about the meton. 3. Democritus is, roughly speaking, the first/the only one in antiquity not only to have written the signifier meton, but to have written it in connection with negation, as Lacan does in THIRD. Were one to laugh about it, the language I serve would be telling Democritus' joke about the meton again, doing away with it by dropping the me from the negation of the nothing that seems to call it, just as our strip does by itself, for to its aid. Democritus, in effect, gave us the gift of the atomos, of the radical real, by eliding the not, me, from it, but in its subjunctivity, in other words, the modal used for demands requiring the subjunctive to be taken into consideration. As a result of which the den was indeed the stowaway, the clandestine passenger, whose clam now controls our destiny. 5. No more of a materialist in that respect than any sensible person, myself or Marx, for example. But I can't swear that this also holds for Freud, who knows what seed of ecstatic words 6 might have sprung up in his soul from a land where the Kabbalah made its way. 50-51-494. So, from Aristotle to Democritus, the Greek knot binding them together is a brutal one, a slip knot in the sense of a noose. If the den ends up being a stowaway, It is because Aristotle forbade it the first class deck the open field of philosophy and forced it to go back where it came from, through a radical translation that joins Democritus's operation to physics, meaning, and truth. Abnegation, then, by signifier, cut, letter, laughter, anything for the sake of the real. Democritus laughed about everything. Egalaponta, Hippolytus said he's the faithful ally of both L-Tordite and psychoanalytic interpretation. 7. Let's begin with A. In the December 15, 1971, session of the Upire seminar, thus during the same period as THIRD-WORLDISM, here is how Lacan spoke about him. Read Aristotle's Metaphysics and I hope you'll feel, as I do, that it's incredibly stupid. 8, 3 or 4 centuries after Aristotle, people naturally began to express the most serious doubts about this text, because they still knew how to read. I must say that Michelet does not hold that opinion, and neither do I, because really, how shall I put it, stupidity acts as proof of authenticity. Whatever sensible things, so to speak, i.e., whatever is related to the real, may be written. Aristotle wondered about the principle. Naturally, he didn't have the slightest idea that the principle is this: that there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. Opus 28-30, my emphasis. I firmly believe that we are in the middle of a contemporary gigantomachy, to borrow the Platonic term used by Heidegger, here. What is at stake is nothing less than changing the principle of all principles, switching from the principle there's no such thing as contradiction to the principle there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. It is the discursivity of this new principle there's no such thing as a sexual relationship that THIRD-WORLDISM puts into play. To understand both the stakes and the method involved, we need to go back to the principle of non-contradiction as it was established in Book Gamma of the Metaphysics, a return to an earlier work of mine on which I must draw 10. The initial statement of the principle of non-contradiction, may I remind you, is the following: the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect. Such a principle is the most certain of all. 11. Incredibly stupid. 12. How is the principle, and the fact that it's stupid, demonstrated? One cannot demonstrate the principle directly. The principle of all principles cannot be demonstrated directly. That even happens to be the aporia of ultimate foundation, as has been noted from Aristotle and on Cassin to Heidegger or Karl Otto Appel. One can only beg or bugger the question. But since some poorly educated people keep asking for a demonstration, Aristotle offers them a demonstration by refutation, which implicates them insofar as they speak and regardless of what they say. Here is that refutation. We can, however, demonstrate negatively even that this view is impossible, if our opponent will only say something, and if he says nothing, it is absurd to attempt to speak with someone who speaks of nothing, insofar as he does not speak at all. For such a man, as such, is seen already to be no better than a mere plant. Gamma 4, 1006a 12-15, my emphasis here and in the following citations translation modified by the author. I'm skipping ahead a bit. The starting point for all such arguments is not the demand that our opponent shall say that something either is or is not, for this one might perhaps take to be a begging of the question, but that he shall say something which means something both for himself and for another, for this is necessary, if he really is to say anything. For, if he means nothing, such a man will not be capable of speaking, either with himself or with another. But if anyone grants this, demonstration will be possible, for we shall already have something definite. The person responsible for the proof, however, is not he who demonstrates but he who listens, for while disowning discourse he listens to discourse. Gamma 4, 1006a 18-26 translation modified by the author. And a few lines later, if one were to say that the word has an infinite number of meanings, obviously speaking would be impossible, for not to have one meaning is to have no meaning, and if words have no meaning, speaking with other people, and indeed with oneself, has been annihilated, for it is impossible to think of anything if we do not think of one thing. But if this is possible, one name might be assigned to this thing. Gamma 4, 1006b 6-11. What happened? The pass happened. Il passé, that is, Aristotle demonstrated the indemonstrable principle of non-contradiction by means of a series of equivalences, taken as self-evident. To speak is to say something, to say something is to mean something, to mean something is to mean something that has one and only one meaning, the same for oneself and for another person. This is what I have called the decision of sense. 13. The principle of non-contradiction is established and can only be established this way. It is grounded in the univocity of sense, nothing else, and certainly not in an intuition of the predicate logic type S cannot be both P and not P at the same time, or the propositional logic type if all S are P, then no S is not P. What is impossible is not for a thing to be the subject of contradictory predicates, but for the same word to both have and not have the same meaning at the same time. Meaning is the first thing encountered and able to be encountered that cannot tolerate contradiction. The world is structured like language, and being Lacan like a meaning. The principle established in this way is established in a mean way, because the opponent of the principle will always already have proved its validity by the very fact of speaking. So, when he denies the principle, you can always come back at him with "but you're the one who said it." And he does have to speak, if he's a man, an animal endowed with logos, a man, and not just a plant. Therein lies all the meanness of the refutation, a refutation that's not just pragmatic, time after time gotcha, but transcendental, grafted onto the conditions of possibility of language as definitional of man's humanity. Speak, if you are a man. 14.1 realizes that the primal opponent of a text such as THIRD is Aristotle, and that metaphysics, or the science of first principles, is really stupid. If it weren't stupid, I really don't see how THIRD could be written. To be able to write it, and for it to be readable, is it readable? The equivalences need to be changed. On the side of philosophy, the sense of a word, contained in its definition, expresses the essence of the thing, and that's why there cannot not be univocity. A man is a man. On the side of Lacan, the soul sense, the one sense, is unsense. 15 That is, the deprived of sense homophony always already enacts equivocation, or rather it is signification, but not sense. 16 There is no sense other than equivocation, and this is called absence, an escape from the Aristotelian norm of sense, a norm that is moreover constitutive of the perennial regulation of language, such that it constantly returns, no more or less so than does the unconscious. Aristotle or ontology as regulation of language, Lacan or psychoanalysis as absent-mindedness, étourdissement. There's no such thing as contradiction. There's no such thing as a sexual relationship. Univocity sense equals essence. Homonymia and equivocation absence. THIRD is inscribed in homonymia and enacts that homonymy by inscribing it in the letter, that is, by writing it, making of it, right from its title, THIRD, an enunciation that one can see, which is the surest way of hearing it. The schema from on interpretation that goes so far as to include written marks, the graphomena, is thus fulfilled, step by step. 17 It is owing to this twofold operation of equivocation and writing that THIRD is situated in the absence that it produces. The dialogue between the opponents, Aristotle and Lacan, would be as follows. Aristotle: you're just a plant. Lacan: no, that's what a man is all about. But you're just an animal. Here is what I have emphasized in italics, boiling it down as much as possible. Language: Lacan's emphasis, then, insofar as this species espèce has its place therein, has no effect there other than the structure that this impact of the real is caused by. Everything about it, language that seems parastating like a semblance of communication, is always a dream, slip of the tongue, or joke. So it's got nothing to do with what's imagined or confirmed in many respects about animal language. The real in animal language shouldn't be ruled out as a kind of univocal communication through which animals, too, in serving as models for us, would make us their dolphins. 19 A function of code, whereby the negative entropy of observation results is produced, operates within it. Moreover, some life behaviors are established therein with symbols that are in every respect similar to ours. The raising of an object to the rank of a signifier of the master signifiant du mater, and the order of the migratory flight, the symbolism of both courtship and threatening displays, work signals, territorial marking, except that these symbols are never equivocal. These equivocations in which the aside of an enunciation is inscribed. 47-48 490-91. Equivocation is linked to the enunciation. The fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is said and what is heard. 20 There's no such thing as animal speech, right? You can't psychoanalyze a dog, or even a cat, and not to the statement of meaning L non-stu sense, that is, what Aristotle presents as sense and Lacan reduces to signification. The symbols of animal language are never equivocal, those of human language, in the sounds of the voice, and, even more disturbing, in letters in the letter, are. 21 We need to distinguish here between the kind of ambiguity that is inscribed by signification by the loop of the cut and the suggestion of a whole, that is, of a structure, which makes sense of this ambiguity. 4483. The kind of ambiguity that is inscribed by signification is not at all important. The proof is that Aristotle is perfectly able to deal with it. It is necessary and sufficient to disambiguate, and that can always be done by distinguishing between meanings in Aristotle's sense of the term and by proposing several words instead of just one. And it makes no difference even if one were to say a man has several meanings, if only they are limited in number, for to each formula there might be assigned a different word. Gamma 4, 1006a34b2. But there is a kind of ambiguity that can't be dealt with, not the kind associated with sense, in Aristotle's sense of the term, that is, with signification in the Lacanian sense, but rather the ambiguity that makes sense in the Lacanian sense, because it refers to interpretation and structure. Interpretation has to do with sense and is contrary to signification 37-480. Or again, the interpretation itself, ambiguous or equivocal so as not to be authoritarian, should make a whole. Or, in plain language for the American students he is addressing, in no case should a psychoanalytic intervention be academic or directive, that is, authoritarian. It should be ambiguous. The analytic interpretation is not meant to be understood, it is meant to make waves. 22. He then goes on to speak about taking a dive into the prompter's box, the prompter, of course, being the subject's unconscious. An act, that's the word for it, all right. Duly noted. The Aristotelian landscape of the decision of sense has changed. Equivocation has become the condition or the rule of sense, with a shift in the meaning of sense. And yet, I'm astonished. In no way do those waves erode the description of the equivocations, in no way do they smooth or wear them away. For the equivocations are still the ones that Aristotle dealt with, the very same ones, and they are still classified according to the same three characteristic levels of the organon: words, sentences, arguments. Here is how they are described by the Lacan of THIRD, in three nodal points: 48-491. 23. 1. I'll begin with homophony, on which spelling depends. 48-491. That's only reasonable spelling is diacritical, which is why Sarkozy Matue Sarkozy called me is so shocking. 24. Even if a counterexample immediately presents itself in French, les poules couvent au couvent. 25. This is a homographic challenge to homophony. For a single way of writing the word there are two different ways of pronouncing it, which is the symmetrical inverse of an étourdi, in which the same pronunciation is valid for the writing of the two different spellings étourdi/étourdite. But it is above all very philosophically correct, with the psychoanalyst being in the tradition of the Heideggerian pre-Socratic poet headed toward language and on the way to la langue. The fact that, in this language of mine, as I played on it above, du tu is a homonym of dieu of them, preserves the trace of that mind game jeu de l'homme by which making two together of them faire dieu du ensemble reaches its limit in making two of them faire du dieu. Others can be found in this text, from parator to semblant. Neologisms that are pronounced like barider and semblant. I maintain that there are no holds barred when it comes to this, because if anyone is within their range without being able to recognize where he is, then it is they that make fools of us. Unless the poets exploit them and the psychoanalyst uses them where appropriate. 48-491. The exact same thing is true, in the Aristotelian homonymy that constitutes the sole etiology to which all language disorders can be attributed. 26. For the homonymies that on sophistical refutations classifies as dependent on language paratenlex and hence linked as closely as possible to the signifier, and which are exemplified in word combination, division, and pronunciation, all of them clearly untranslatable. For example, depending on whether you aspirate the O in the word hros or not, it can mean either boundary or shore, and if you pronounce hu cataluis like a relative clause it will mean where you live, i.e., a house, whereas if you pronounce it like a negation you do not live, it will make you say that your house is a negation. As can be seen, the diacritical power of writing, a handy pharmacon. 27 makes it possible to distinguish between meanings and to eliminate homonymy. The portmanteau and palimpsest typewriting of THIRD allows it to perform the additional feat of making the meanings legible as so many ingredients of a mixture and a pileup, that is, to inscribe the whirling of tropes and the resonance of what is said in the absent-mindedness l'étourderie of the master whose blunders keep ruining the tricks his valet is knocking himself out, playing for his sake mascarille to himself, and you're compelled to tack and tack again. 28. This way of keeping homonyms together is similar to the maneuver of the sophist, who uses homonymy as he pleases because he goes no further than what is expressed in the sounds of the voice and in words. Gamma 5, 1009a 21-2 translation modified. Maneuvered by Aristotle into acting as his opponent. Since an Aristotelized person is someone undergoing Aristotelization, the sophist resists to such an extent that he ends up getting himself excluded from humanity. He's a plant, i.e., nature that merely rustles, not even an animal. Yet the sophist's stratagem is no different from either the poets or the psychoanalysts. Since he is, after all, the first one to enjoy speaking for its own sake, for the pleasure of speaking, he could cure the philosopher of his hauntology 29 along the way, provided the latter asks to be cured. 2. For interpretation is backed up here by grammar. 48-491. Thus, the analysts who cling to the guardrail of general psychology aren't even able to see how Freud, in these brilliant cases, is making his subjects recite their lessons in their own grammar. Except that he keeps telling us that, from what each of them says du dit de chacun, We must be prepared to revise the parts of speech we thought we could keep from what they said before. This is of course what the linguists set themselves as an ideal, but even though the English language seems parist advantageous to Chomsky, I noted that, thanks to an equivocation, my first sentence contradicts his transformational tree. 3048-49 491-92. In this first sentence written by Lacan on the blackboard, the fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is said and what is heard. 31 You have the grammatical right to understand saying the fact that one says remains forgotten behind what is said and what is heard, and or to understand saying the fact that one says remains forgotten in what is heard, behind what is said. These are not the same constructions, they are not the same interpretations. This grammatical equivocation bears the lovely Greek name amphibology. The syntax can be attacked from both sides at once, as in I saw a man being beaten with my own eyes and I saw a man being beaten with my own eyes. Or worse, sigant alleging, to speak of silent things, in the neuter accusative plural, and to speak while keeping silent, in the masculine nominative singular, which combines homophony and amphibology. Make waves fit des vagues. The very ones that on sophistical refutations diagnoses, disdains, and prohibits. It's logic, without which interpretation would be idiotic, the first people to make use of it, of course, being those who, in order to transcendentalize the existence of the unconscious, arm themselves with Freud's remark that the unconscious is indifferent to contradiction. It probably hasn't gotten through to them yet that more than one logic has availed itself of the right to prohibit such a foundation and nonetheless to remain formalized, meaning suitable for the methem. Who could blame Freud for such an effective obscurantism and for the clouds of darkness that, from Jung to Abraham, he promptly gathered in response to him? Not I, to be sure, who also bear some responsibility on this front au cet endroit from my opposite side de mon inverse. 33 I'd just like to remind you that no logical development, and this has been the case from before Socrates and from elsewhere than in our tradition, has ever derived from anything other than a kernel of paradoxes, to use the universally accepted term by which we designate the equivocations based on this point, which, despite coming third here, could just as well come first or second. 49 492. With logic, what is involved now, completely in keeping with Aristotle, are certain types of arguments. Aristotle classifies these as fallacies independent of language, exotes lexios. In effect, they are unrelated to the semantic ambiguity of terms or homonymy. Strictly speaking, one equals the first meaning of logos, word, investigated in the categories, or to the grammatical ambiguity of the combination of words in a sentence, or amphibology. 2 equals the second meaning of logos, the sentence, investigated in on interpretation. Rather, they are related to the combination of sentences, thus to syllogisms themselves. 3 equals the third, but it could also be considered the first or second meaning of logos argument, investigated in the analytics. Such arguments, Aristotle further says, are therefore pseudo-arguments, either because the argument itself is formally false and only apparently conclusive, it is a pseudo-argument in the strict sense of the term, or because it is materially false, and the premises on which the argument is based already make use of syntactic or semantic homonymies, they are pseudo-premises. It is indeed by dint of logical paradoxes that logic has progressed, ever since the age-old Freudo-Lacanian type paradox of the liar, that of the Cretan who is reproached for saying he is going to Krakow so that it will be thought he is going to Lemberg when he is really going to Krakow. 34 But not logic only, nor by logic only. Besides, what does logic only mean? As soon as you wonder, as an Aristotelian, about what makes it possible to say that non-being is non-being, that is, about the plurality of meanings of being, which immediately produces paradoxes that no sooner return than they disappear. 35 Sophistical refutations in every respect, then, except that, and this is why I am giving long citations, logic, says Lacan, has evolved since Aristotle. There are formal consistencies that are based on principles other than the principle of non-contradiction. In particular, there are some that don't exclude the middle. This doesn't have anything to do with Freud. It is possible to argue, in keeping with Freud, that the unconscious knows no contradiction, and to do so completely logically, using a proper methem, in other words, using a rational another meaning of logos, coherent, and transmissible argument. With the hypothesis of the unconscious, Freud expanded the meaning of sense so as to let nonsense, slips, and dreams back into it. Even if the navel of the dream trembles, what is emphasized by Freud is first and foremost, in accordance with the Aristotelian decision of sense, a gain in meaning and coherence, rather than the fundamental nonsense of all use of sense. 36 But what about the new logics? Does this mean that these new logics involve a principle of substitution that is not determined by the principle of non-contradiction? They are logics that don't exclude the middle, But did they come up with there's no such thing as a sexual relationship? Of course they didn't, even if Lawrenson can help to unleash the truth. 37 So I think we need to make a distinction between two different ways of not being satisfied with Aristotle's principle. First, there is the way that preserves an Aristotelian content, with the decision of sense and coherence determined by contradiction. The age-old notion of paradox is based solely on contradiction and disappears along with it, just as both the easily dealt with homonymy of words and the amphibology of sentences do. And Aristotle deals with them constantly. That's where THIRD ends. The other way makes homonymy, amphibology, and paradox the condition of semantic as well as syntactic and syllogistic sense as opposed to signification. It makes the prompter's box the general or transcendental condition of all sense and logic, hence also the condition of the true-false bivalence that thereby becomes just one particular case. This is a type of equivocation that cannot be dealt with. 38 This is why I am truly astonished, disappointed even, by the hyper-Aristotelian inventory of equivocations in THIRD, where it seems to be a point of pride. Because, given the way it is written and all its creativity, THIRD ought to leave such an inventory far behind, proceeding otherwise and from elsewhere from one's conscious consent to the unconscious, which could perhaps be called glass and hide, or mutual domestication, to which the joke, laughter as interpreter even as the interpreter of ontology and as far as can be from the seriousness of Aristotelian logic, should bear witness. Could it be the case that, by being so far from gamma, we end up being so minutely close to on sophistical refutations? As though Lacan weren't equal to the primal gigantomachy, duped and seduced as he was by the use of that which dupes and seduces par excellence, the logos logauker in speaking for its own sake, speaking for the pleasure of speaking of the equivocations that can be easily dealt with. How can we think at one and the same time that Lacan won out against Aristotle? We no longer speak, after THIRD, in THIRD, as we did with or in Aristotle. The principle of all principles is no longer the same and that nothing has changed in terms of the taxonomy that regulates the critical issue of equivocation. Either Lacanian language will already have spoken in Aristotle's logos or Lacan is nothing but an updated Aristotle. Lacan up against Aristotle. If Lacan is a plant, he is not, for someone like Aristotle, a weed to be gotten rid of, but a slightly uprooted plant that can be easily replanted back into the flower bed, that Aristotelian order of discourse whose modular border he constitutes. Lacan in the place of the sophist, able to be dealt with and assimilated aristotically. The psychoanalyst is the presence of the sophist in our time, but with a different status, a status that makes him much easier to handle by the order of discourse. 39. But let's go on with this hostile exchange, as if it involved two languages that were equally good at comebacks, and see how to highlight the moves. Aristotle, you're just a plant. Lacan, oh, go on, you stupid animal. A man's an animal endowed with logos. L man's a speaking being parlator. A logos, I said. L la langue, I said. Each term will be defined again in an ultimately quite univocal way. We are speaking beings. Parlators, a word it would be more advantageous to use than unconscious because we quibble about idle chatter, for one thing, and over the fact that it has from language that we get this crazy idea that there is being. 40 Right, la langue is one word, that's how I'll write it from now on. 41 In other words, as Lacan puts it in THIRD, the unconscious, insofar as it is structured like a language, namely, la langue that it inhabits, is subject to the ambiguity by which each language is distinguished. 47 490. All these shifts in terminology are consequences of the primal gigantomachy. Human beings are afflicted, so to speak, with language. By means of this language they're afflicted with, they compensate for what is an absolutely inescapable fact, namely, that there's no sexual relationship among human beings. 42 The change of language enacts the change of principle and is simultaneously the result of it with regard to two sensitive issues: the letter writing, inscription, and the relationship to the real. Lacan sees in Aristotle's analytics something like a beginning of topology. It consists precisely in making holes in writing. All animals are mortal. You get rid of animals and you get rid of mortals, and in their place you put the ultimate in writing, a simple letter. D 81 to 82. Aristotle invented writing in letters and logic at the same time as he invented quantification, which is to say that he made a hole in writing with the letter, he made a hole in the universal with the know-all that he was able to write. So Lacan may well be the winner the first time around by dominating Aristotle the inventor, precisely insofar as Aristotle was really stupid because he was constrained, restricted by non-contradiction. This is precisely the basis on which I combine the all of the universal more altered than one might imagine in the for all of the quantifier with the there exists, say that the quantic pairs it with, its difference from what's implied by the proposition Aristotle calls particular being perfectly obvious. I combine them because the there exists say in question, by acting as a limit to the for all, is what affirms or confirms it, an objection that was already raised to Aristotle's contradictory pairs by an old saying. 15,459. So which old saying is it that objects to the universality of non-contradiction? It's just the exception proves the rule. No more nor less. 43. That there exists a in question acts as a limit to the for all the exception proves the rule. Really not stupid. Lacan beats Aristotle in that he forces him to confront the structure of the refutative demonstration on which alone the principle of non-contradiction is based. When he formulated the universality of the principle of non-contradiction, Aristotle kept at bay the notion that the other was needed, that the one who not solui kini pa was needed, that there needed to be one for whom not un por kini pa, without which none of this could work. That he needed the sophist as the basis for the principle. Yet it's amazing, and therefore really obvious in the textuality of Book Gamma, when the exception some people who through want of education demand a demonstration of the indemonstrable become those who seek and love truth the most, Empedocles, Democritus, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, and Homer. All of Greece. That's the exception that proves the universal rule Gamma 4, from 1006a5 to 11, some, who through want of education, to 5, 1009b 33 to 9, the gallery of all the founding fathers. Lacan returns as a sophist, but a sophist who is defined as being necessary to Aristotle's principle, which is to say there is no universal proposition L universal without an exception that founds it. The exception constitutes the universal L universal. For every man, to speak is to say something, only provided there is at least one man who not unom kini pa. The fact that everything then comes together / falls apart otherwise is contemporary a subject, the phallic function, neither true nor false but something fallen in the whole, and a far more complicated Mobius and torus-shaped topology than the inside/boundary/outside topology that defines Aristotelian sense. 44. As for the logos, Lacan, with his like a language, wins another round in the perceptual norm match, namely, the round involving the letter, hundreds of years after the invention of writing. With only the final T of Lee Turdet, he writes and inscribes the letter as primary, as the primary dit mention. 45. I begin with homophony on which spelling depends, which should be understood as I begin with inner heterography, culturally audible and internal to homophony. We've moved from the word to the signifier and from the signifier to the letter. Here are a few brief quotations from Lacan to help clarify what is involved. For the word I have substituted the word signifier, and this means that it gives rise to equivocation, that is, always to several possible meanings. 46. Switching from word to signifier would keep us in the realm of easy to deal with equivocation if we were to stick with the signifier, with what we hear. But the signifier is not the phoneme. The signifier is the letter. Only the letter makes a whole. 47. There is no letter without some la langue. That's in fact the problem. How can la langue be precipitated into the letter? 48. And even here in Lee Turdet this saying of analysis stems only from the fact that the unconscious, because it is structured like a language, namely, the la langue that it inhabits, is subject to the equivocation by which each is distinguished. 47. 491. For my part, it is each that I would immediately like to highlight, an opening onto something that, in Aristotle, is never under any circumstances at work: the differential plurality of languages. A specific language is nothing but the sum total of the equivocations that its history has allowed to remain in it. 47. 490. 49. If we stop reading here, leaving out the lalongs involved in the fact that it's the unconscious that's at issue, in other words, if we take the sentence at face value, what we're doing is composing a dictionary. Untranslatables, a vocabulary of European philosophies, which is based on the sum total of the equivocations that the history of each language has allowed to remain in it. The languages of Europe, in this case, since we can't do any better. We draw upon equivocations and homonyms such as sense direction, sense meaning, and sense perception, mere piece world farming community, or logos, and we work on them, text by text, like symptoms of worlds. But there's something more that follows, namely a specific language is nothing but the sum total of the equivocations that its history has allowed to remain in it. It is the vein whose real, the only real, as regards the analytic discourse, that brings about its end. The real that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship has left a deposit in it down through the ages. And here the philosopher may basically become disillusioned or bored. In a dictionary of untranslatables, taking each language as a la langue, one will have found the way in which the real, namely, the fact that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, has left a deposit. It's not very funny, or is it perhaps very funny? Two can play at the game of reduction. But where is the gain in this? The gain lies in going from truth to the real, and the real is that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, end of story. That's where it all starts from and where it all returns. Being is just one effect of discourse among others, notably notement, and ontology is a shame ontology, but what can you say? The fact that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship no longer notably notement but notably monotimement. The fact that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. There's no other real and nothing else to be said. It's monotonous. And the way to say it is to write the real which, as a result, is not something real with a capital R. It's easier to write than to say, even though some people may always be nattering on about it. Un discours qui ne serait pas du semblant and, later, encore clarify the link between the new principle and the letter. There's no such thing as a sexual relationship should obviously not be understood in terms of ontology. There is no question of essentializing the non-relationship, but people still have sex, don't they? Only the impossibility for logic to posit itself in a justifiable way is something quite striking. But in this very failure there may be revealed the nature of the proposition that in fact has the closest relationship with language functioning, namely, the following proposition: the relationship, the sexual relationship, cannot be written, my emphasis. And were there no such thing as analytic discourse, you would continue to speak like bird-brains tourneaux, to sing the current discours disque courant, making the disc go around, that disc that turns, because there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, a formulation that can only be articulated thanks to the entire edifice of analytic discourse, and that I have been drumming into you for quite some time, from the scatterbrain l'étourdi to the bird-brain tourneau, and from the bird-brain to the numbskull Lacan. Aren't they all one family? But drumming it into you, I must nevertheless explain it. It is based only on the written, in the sense that the sexual relationship cannot be written. My emphasis here. Everything written stems from the fact that it will forever be impossible to write, as such, the sexual relationship. It is on that basis that there is a certain effect of discourse, which is called writing. One could, at a pinch, write X R Y, and say X is man, Y is woman, and R is the sexual relationship. Why not? The only problem is that it's stupid, because what is based on the signifier function law fonction de signifiant of man and woman are mere signifiers that are altogether related to the current use of language. If there is a discourse that demonstrates that to you, it is certainly analytic discourse, because it brings into play the fact that woman will never be taken up except quod matrem. Woman serves a function in the sexual relationship only qua mother. Those are overall truths, but they will lead us further. Thanks to what? Thanks to writing. Translation slightly modified. When one writes XRY, one writes it, but the only problem is that it's stupid. The woman will never be taken up except quod matrem, and the man quod castrationem, meaning as, qua, als, hey, like Aristotle's being elaton outside of first philosophy, qua number, line, fire, but not qua being. We are in the realm of strict doctrine here, and there's no way out of it. Aristotle didn't have the slightest idea that the principle is this, that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. Language, in its function as an existent, in the final analysis only connotes the impossibility of symbolizing the sexual relationship among the beings that inhabit this language, because it is to this habitat that they owe their ability to speak. If interpreted straightforwardly, this sentence is the final or definitive equivalent of the animal endowed with logos, along with to take the place of the political man is more political than any other animal. Aristotle began, precisely because he is endowed with logos, something of Heidegger's dwelling in its provenance from Die Sprache. What difference does it make? In my opinion, there are two kinds of answers to this. The first answer would be no, there is nothing purely doctrinal about it, and the proof is that it has to do with a clinic. That's certainly a good answer overall. It's a way of saying that we're no longer dealing with metaphysics but psychoanalysis, and Lacanian psychoanalysis at that. It's up to you to decide whether you're interested in it, whether you're involved in it, or whether you don't care about it, just as it's your rightful right to fulfill and not to be interested in Aristotelian metaphysics. There's no such thing as contradiction, no such thing as a sexual relationship, and whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, that's how you speak, that's how your logos, its logic and logic as such, are underpinned. Take my word for it, your conscious mind is structured like a generally logical Aristotelian language. And your unconscious is structured like an absent language, like a lay langue. That's how you speak, how it speaks. Are you the direct object complement? But so what? Observe the effects, the first of these being the effectiveness of the saying dire of analysis, how to really do things with words. The saying of analysis, to the extent that it's effective, produces the apophantic, 55, which, by virtue of its mere existence, differs from the proposition. This is how it puts the propositional function in its place, since, as I think I've shown, The latter gives us the only prop that makes up for the absence of the sexual relationship. Lacan's formulas, like syllogisms in the sphere of sense, are the crutches that allow the analyst, first of all, to get around and be effective in that absence in which you seek his or her help. The second answer, which is more entertaining for a philosopher who's a connoisseur of antiquity, involves turning to Democritus, in order to reconnect the two languages. We're dealing with Lacanian psychoanalysis, at the heart of metaphysical heterodoxy. So we need to begin at the end of THIRD-WORLDISM, basing ourselves on the Democritus who Lacan says gave us the gift of the radical real. It's a philosophically perspicacious way of deontologizing, but how so? Let's read things again and clarify them. That won't be progress, since there's none that doesn't bring regret with it, regret about a loss. But we're one to laugh about it. The language I serve would end up telling Democritus' joke about the met and again doing away with it by dropping the me from the negation of the nothing that seems to call it, as our strip does by itself, to its aid. Democritus, in effect, gave us the gift of the atomos, of the radical real, by eliding the not, me, from it, but in its subjunctivity, in other words, the modal used for demands requiring the subjunctive to be taken into consideration. As a result of which the den was indeed the stowaway, the clandestine passenger whose clan now controls our destiny. No more of a materialist in that respect than any sensible person, myself or Marx, for example. For once, I understand everything I think about the intertwined strands in the overall diseño. Den is not a Greek word. It isn't in either the Badiou Greek-French dictionary or the Little Scott Jones Greek-English dictionary, despite the latter's being more complete. It is a word that doesn't exist in the complete lexicon of the Greek language. How can you convey the meaning of a word that doesn't exist in the language? That's what you wonder, too, when you read, and when you translate, Lacan. Den does, however, appear in an excellent dictionary, the Dictionnaire étymologique de la langue grecque by Chantrain, who refers the reader to the Democritus fragment 156, specifically to the formulation me malin to den to metanenai, where den is interpreted as soma, body, and metan as kenon, void, to be no more body than void. Chantrain adds that a genitive dinos can already be found in the Greek lyric poet Alcaeus 700 to 600 BCE, in a doubtful and obscure passage, Kaike udenek dinos genoito, in which dinos can be translated as nothing or rather something. 57 Nothing or rather something. Now there's a wonderful equivalence for you. And Chantrain concludes this has nothing to do with the modern Greek word den, meaning nothing. That's quite a grandiose denial. All theories about den are wrong, except for mine. Now for etymology, adds Chantrain, since that's what his work as a trailblazer involves in Democritus, it den is clearly a term derived more or less artificially from uden. 59 More or less artificial, and rather more than less. This thing that's not in the dictionaries is something manufactured, made up, a coined word, as Lacan aptly put it. It is simultaneously a Democritian terminus technicus just as quiddity is a scholastic one used to render to tnani, which is one of Aristotle's, and a Greek play on words, as if the phrase were one to laugh about at chuon and re were heard the first time around as coming from the verb to laugh rear, while the second time is based on the word nothing rian. To understand the ways in which the word was coined, you need tools such as signifier, writing, negation, modality, one, and, above all, you need the idea of a cut, a false cut. The den, if I wanted to define it in such a way that we would still understand the nothing in it, is a signifier produced by an topological cut in the writing of the subjective modal negation, such that, by saying one, the other is also produced. Indeed, all of this is inscribed in the den. Let's begin again with the Democritus fragment, with a bit of basic philology now. A pre-Socratic fragment, such as this one, is listed in the original sourcebook, the Bible, that is the Deal's edition as revised by Krantz, whence the initials DK Fragmented Erevor Socratiker. The fact that it is listed as a B fragment means that it is regarded as an authentic fragment, as opposed to the Testimonia, which are referred to as A fragments. It is authentic, but in a heterogeneous context, in this instance a text by Plutarch, against Colotes, that cites it, a text written 600 years after Democritus as a response to one of Epicurus's disciples. So the meaning of its meaning is not self-evident. I would simply say that Plutarch, flirting with his opponent, albeit in a properly philosophical way, was trying to get Democritus back on the right side of metaphysics by separating him, rightly so, of course, in Lacan's opinion as well as my own, from Protagoras and the sophistic confusion to which Colotes had assimilated him. He thus gives the fragment in italics, followed by its intralinguistic translation into the language of metaphysics. Hocolitsis pale peri lexanto andros, en he diarizatai me malin to den to metanenai, den men onimazon to soma, Medenda to kenon, hos kai tu pizantina kai hapostes inidian toi kantos. Calotes misunderstood the way our man spoke when he makes the following distinction: the den no more exists than the medon. Democritus means body by den and void by medon, indicating that the latter, too, has a certain nature and subsistence of its own. The reality of this fragment and of the invention of the den is also attested by two other Testimonia Hensae fragments, one by Galen a century after Plutarch and the other by Simplicius another 3 centuries after Galen. These are extremely interesting texts, each with its own thematics and systematics, written in a fairly pure philosophical language. In short, when you read them, the passion for doxography, linked to field research on transmission, interpretation, distortion, reconstruction, and failure of the pass 63 might grab you the way it has me. To deal with on the elements according to Hippocrates, Galen, the doctor, proceeded by way of an analysis of Democritus and, more precisely, by way of an analysis of the ways in which Democritus distinguished linguistic convention by convention, according to the law from something like the real, making use of a very unusual term here, in reality, as it is usually translated, or genuinely, from medios, true, genuine by convention, sweet and by convention, bitter by convention, color but in reality atoms and void, said Democritus. Galen then proposed an interpretation and intralinguistic translation of this strange Democritian terminology. The expression by convention means exactly this: by custom, namaste, as it were, and relative to us, not in accordance with the actual nature of things. Kataton ton pragmaton ten pisan. He speaks of the latter, in turn, of in reality, taking the word from the term real, which means true. And the whole meaning of his statement would be this: among men something is held to be white and black and sweet and bitter and all else of this kind. But in truth the totality of things is den and medon kata ten aletheon den kai medon esti tapanta. When he reaches these words, Galen can only continue his explanation by changing the language he uses, for he himself, Democritus, said this too when he called the atoms den and the void medon. 66. So we have den, body and atom, soon to be defined as little bodies, course, separated from one another, and medon, the void, to kenon, soon to be defined as chora, but let's leave that aside. Simplicius the Aristotelian, commenting on Aristotle's On the Heavens, concluded with a definite, even definitive, interpretation. Democritus thinks that the nature of eternal things consists in small substances, infinite in quantity, microzousias plethos paris, and for them he posits a place, distinct from them and infinite in extent. He calls this place by the names void to kenoi, nothing toi audini, and infinite, and each of the substances he calls den, solid toi nastoi, and being toi ondi. Move along, there's nothing to see here. Den is being eleton. Aristotle and ontology have one. Democritus amounts to the same, and the real is only ever something true and natural. Let's start over again with the word that doesn't exist, because it doesn't deceive. It doesn't exist in a very specific way. Like all signs, it is arbitrary, in the sense that its only value lies in being different. What does exist, and which it is different from, is the negative term, which can take two forms, uden or medon. These are two adjectives no in the masculine and feminine forms, and two pronouns no one, nothing, which, in the neuter accusative, can act as adverbs in no way, not at all. The fact that there are two of them is very characteristic of the Greek language. It has two types of negation, a so-called factual, or objective, negation, inu, and a modal negation, of impossibility and prohibition, a so-called prohibitive, subjective negation, in me. The latter is used, primarily in moods other than the indicative, in both main and subordinate clauses, for orders, warnings, wishes and regrets, and eventualities and possibilities that are denied or feared. Medon, like mion, is something that cannot and must not be, or be there or be such. And such a way it is nothingness, perhaps. Uden, on the other hand, like aucon, is merely something that is not there, that is not such and such a way, but might well be or might have been a person who is dead, for example, or something not there unrean, perhaps. 68. So den contrasts with uden Simplicius and, in a more insistent, assertive way, with medon Plutarch, Galen. In both cases, the negative word is very obvious. It is based on hen, one, the numerical adjective in the neuter, preceded by a negative prefix. What's more, it is not a question of simple negation or me not, but of the simplest of compound negatives, compounded, in this case, with the commonest and smallest negative prefix in Greek to ud, mead not even, like the Latin nequidem, or neither nor when it is doubled. So in uden, as in medon, one hears ud hen, not even one, and in mead hen not even, and especially not, one. From ud hen and mead hen to uden and medon, it follows inexorably this is proper Greek, sound etymology. The problem is that, along this road, you don't encounter den. I would even say that it is impossible to encounter den when you follow the thread of language, and to say that sentence in Greek I would use me, not to. Den is the product of a false cut, anomalous when compared with the etymology inscribed in words. It is something of a sign signifier, a deliberate fabrication, the mark of a difference. Affirmation. Objective negation. Subjective negation. Signifying invention. Henuden equals out hen. Meden equals med hen me den. Den. Root word etymology. Etymology false cut 1 nothing equals not even 1 nothing equals anything but 1. Less than nothing. I would add that it is impossible to regard this as anything but a sort of violence, a violence that would be evident, I dare say, to all Greeks. I call Homer and Plato as my witnesses. Plato first, since he testifies about the immediate perception of the etymon and meton. Thus, in the Sophist, the stranger with parasite on the horizon shows how, if you stick to Parmenides and his statement non-being is not, the very possibility of falsity disappears, since, in one way or another, falsity causes what is not to be. Fortunately, Parmenides logos itself, his statement as he states it, his enunciation, therefore, if it is tortured a bit, admits that non-being is. Parmenides says in effect never can things that are not me ought to be forced to be. 70 However, this is doubly contradictory, both because the logos confers a certain kind of existence on non-beings merely by saying them words are not nothing, and because it is a plural non-beings, things that are not, and quantity is obviously quantity of something, of a unit, or, in other words, the plural only exists in relation to the singular. The stranger, do you consent to this point and consider that it's a necessity for him who is saying something to say at least some one thing hen get? Theaetetus. That's so. The stranger, for you'll assert that at least something is a sign of one hen, and a pair of somethings tine of two, and somethings tines of many. Theaetetus. Of course. The stranger, it does seem, then, that it's most necessary for him who is not saying something me to be saying, absolutely, as it seems, nothing meton. Hen me meton, an insistence on number nothing is not even one, med hen, and this is heard to such an extent that it serves as a matrix for the demonstrative evidence. Saying meton becomes a performative self-contradiction. And it's against the backdrop of Homer as the great precursor, as usual. It is indeed the quintessential wordplay of the Odyssey that resonates beneath it, and Berard speaks affably of an avalanche of puns. We are with Odysseus and his companions in the cave of the Cyclops. Instead of welcoming them as their host, the monster devours 2 of them for dinner, washing them down with milk from his sheep. The next day he goes out to graze his flock. When he returns, after milking the sheep, he gobbles up another 2 of Odysseus's companions. Odysseus, who has had time to think it all over and hatch his plot, offers him a big bowl of wine. The Cyclops asks for 3 refills and winds up getting drunk to the gills. Odysseus then says, "So you ask me the name I'm known by, Cyclops? Nobodiotis, that's my name. Nobodiotis, so my mother and father call me, all my friends call me." 9.408-11. 73 The drunkard falls asleep. Odysseus and his companions blind him with a red-hot stake made from an olive branch. Polyphemus wrenches the bloody stake out of his eye and bellows to rouse his neighbors. The other Cyclops cry out to him, "Is somebody meat is rustling your flocks against your will? Is somebody meat is trying to kill you now by fraud or force? Is somebody? Meat is, because they do not believe there can actually be somebody, to which the Cyclops can only reply, "Nobody, friends, is killing me now, by fraud and not by force." Otis Mictani. The same sentence is construed to mean nobody's killing me now, by fraud and not by force by Polyphemus who says it, and nobody's killing me now either by fraud or by force by the Cyclops who hear it. And it is here that we can gauge all the usefulness of the pleonastic ni in French, which Lacan, moreover, armed with Damaret and Pichon, always made a big deal about. Polyphemus, in proper French, would have made himself understood or he would have been corrected. And the chorus of Cyclops continues, "If you're alone and nobody's meat is trying to overpower you now, look, it must be a plague sent here by mighty Zeus, and there's no escape from that. You'd better pray to your father, Lord Poseidon." The Cyclops lumber off, and Odysseus is then heard in voice-over laughter. "Filled my heart to think how my name had duped them one and all, and my great matis, that is, my cunning and my plan." Translation modified by the author. From Otis, a proper noun denoting a person, hence someone, to Otis, a negation in a sentence, no one, in the sense of ud is, not someone, nobody. Then, from Otis and utis to metis and matis, the signifying chain is in place right from the start in Odysseus's mind. This is even precisely what the term metis denotes: intelligence from the overall perspective, and Zeus's great plan to the cunning of Odysseus's tricks, intelligence, of either the naturally technical or the artistic variety, both that of the octopus and that of the sophist, including the intelligence involved in that skill peculiar to human beings, linguistic skill. Odysseus's metis uses logos in its grammatical and syntactic operations, where it connects with semantics proper, to wit where equivocation comes into play. Just think about what happens when a cocky Odysseus, out of narcissism or out of his quest for identity, emerges from the efficiency of wordplay to shout from his departing ship who he is to the Cyclops, who is still within hearing range. Cyclops: if any man on the face of the earth should ask you who blinded you, shamed you, so say Odysseus, raider of cities, he gouged out your eye, Laertes' son who makes his home in Ithaca. Polyphemus implores Poseidon to cast a great curse on him. The Greeks were so close to their goal, and now, on account of these needless remarks, they are back to square one. Homer serves as a witness for me here, first and foremost as regards the force of etymology, since it makes linguistic decomposition ever imminent. To meet is, not somebody, anything but somebody, nobody. But the metis of Homer's language, in its first calm yet disruptive wordplay, also bears witness to the positive-negative two-sidedness and the ease of reversal. Negation has an ontologically charged heredity. Standard French, to an even greater extent than Greek, testifies to this. Thus, nobody personne was originally somebody, a person une personne, from persona, the actor's mask, which is hardly something insignificant. And nothing rien was originally rem, a thing, in the accusative, un rien feminine in Old French, which un rien masculine gradually did away with the word, as the Dictionnaire historique de la langue française in fact says, provides an abridged version of the evolution of the etymological meaning of thing reversed into nothingness. The same is true of the Spanish nada, based on the Latin res nada, the past participle of nasci, to be born, nothing something born. And when it's not the positive thing that changes meaning directly, the difference between, and creativity of, languages can be seen in the choice of what is negated. For example, I don't believe it. I can't see a thing. I don't understand jack about it, and even I don't understand diddly squat about it. Medin, metis, not one, not anyone, nihil no hilum. If the dictionaries know what they're talking about, that little black spot at one end of a bean, and nemo, not a man, nothing and nobody, not a thing and not a body, and nichts nothing in German, not a wit, a little demon, in terms of mythos, or, in terms of logos, not a wicht, from Wesen, essence. It is from this general order of languages, the order of their meaning, that the den differs even as it reveals it. Through the odd conflation of the last letter of the negation and the negated positive, it forces us to understand that the atom is not only not an affirmation or a position being or the one, but that it is also not their negation, that it does not have the consistency of nothingness or of nothing. The atom is literally less than nothing. It should be called nothing in, or, to preserve its rejected etymology, ot one un. Den. Ot one is the name of the atom insofar as it can no longer be confused with the being of ontology or be regarded as an elementary body in physics. German, in particular the German of the Diels-Kranz translation, comes through with incredible distinction and complicity in this regard. It reactivates a term from Rhenish mysticism, das exist hört. Nichts mehr als das Nichts, which is nichts minus the end, but the operation is less disruptive from the outset, hence less connected with the signifier. We once again encounter etymology, with the right cut enict. However, as no one can be sure which ict is involved, demon or essence, we are obliged to hear simultaneously the ich, the I, which was reformed at the end of the Epicean mystical union. Another treasure, another rupture. To stick with contemporary French, Lacan has Democritus say nothing, perhaps? Not perhaps nothing, but not nothing. I would love to make him say not nothing, but less than nothing ot one, since high on a pat. 81. It must be firmly maintained that this is not a way of founding the one. The den can't be tamed inasmuch as it doesn't become a principle. That is why it differs markedly from what Lacan, at almost the same time his attention was focused on it, calls taking explicit advantage of nada, the nade, or, in capital letters, the nade, which comes first before the monad, and is constituted by the empty set whose breaking through franchisement is precisely how the one is constituted, the way and designated by lac, the place where a hole is made. The bag with a hole in it at the basis of the yodlun. The den can only be thought after the one, as a subtractive operation, not as an origin, with a hole in it or not. It cannot be dialecticized precisely insofar as it not an assumed and sublated negation of negation, but a subtraction after negation, and thereby a trick, a fiction, obtained by critical secondarity. It is not a way in but a way out, an escape hatch that acts as a stumbling block to philosophy's origin and makes its history, Hence that of physics, too, change direction, like the clinamen that Lacan compared it to early on. 83 It is clear that the translations, even the numerous intralinguistic translations, can do nothing but re-ontologize. Democritus is not a materialist anymore, Lacan says, than Freud or you and I are. Moreover, whether in THIRD-WORLDISM, Encore, or the four fundamental concepts, it is very consistently in connection with idealism that Lacan refers to Freud. Atomos idea. The atom is an idea. Atoms, which are also called ideas, are everything, Plutarch, against Calotes. The idea that is the atom is constantly being distorted into materialism turned back into physics. In this regard I am once again following Heinz Wisman, who takes the expression atomos idea as both title and emblem. Aristotle is the true architect of this perverse translation of idealism into materialism, a physics designed to jibe with metaphysics, which is a misinterpretation of Democritus. It is Aristotle who passes atoms off as beings, a little less being than his own being eton, of course, or a little more of a being eton and a little less being etra on a scale of ontotheology in this case, as indivisible, quasi-invisible particles, but the combination of which makes bodies visible. Nevertheless, atoms stick to your guns, Democritus or den, less than nothing. A vestige of the negation of the one, of identity and of being eleton, a trajectory of thought, the wave of an ironic operation on being eletra extending sophistry's operation. Not just one more discourse, more fundamental or fundamentalist, on physics, but a physics of discourse, hence a discourse of another kind on physics, linked to a scathing critique of the ontology that congeals into metaphysics. Atoms are the material name of the elements that make up the logos and are responsible for its power. The logos is a powerful lord who with the finest and most invisible bodies microdata somatikaya phanastatoi performs the most divine acts. To say that atomism is a physical representation of discourse is to say that discourse is the proper object of physics, or even that the logos is the physis that needs to be described. Basically, it is only ever a question of taking seriously the fact that man is an animal endowed with logos, that the nature of man is his culture. THIRD-WORLDISM has all the more reason to end with Democritus, and as much as Democritus, to represent discourse physically, conceived of his atoms as letters. Nothing but ideas, but dreamed up and reconceived each time by the stylus. The hand of style is the man, the trace of the stylus is the atom. The properties of the atom refer to the ductus of writing. As Heinz Wisman has relentlessly demonstrated, thereby reconnecting with a long, hidden interpretive tradition. Aristotle, who distorted atomism into the physics of elementary bodies, was at once honest and crafty enough not to conceal anything about the model of writing, though he immediately proposed a translation reduction of it to features that were compatible with those of the bodies in his own physics. That was the start of the great assimilation of atomism. In Book Alpha of the Metaphysics, the three differences that are the causes of all the others are so named by Leucippus and Democritus and named again by Aristotle. These differences, Leucippus and Democritus say, are three-shape schema and order taxon and position thesin. For they say that what is differentiated only by rhythm rus moi and intercontact diathesia, and turning trope and of these rhythm is shape, intercontact is order, and turning is position. For A differs from N in shape, and from Na in order, X from E in position. Rhythm then of the waves, of the vicissitudes of life, or of people's moods doesn't connote the shape or the figure, the visible form schema, morph, eidos that enables an object to be self-identical and recognizable to someone looking at it, but the way the object arises out of its own movement, caught up in change and flux, the way music is, the ductus of writing that produces one letter rather than another. Intercontact is not the order that inscribes succession in space and hierarchy, but the points of contact that determine both the way that the ductus divides into sections to form a letter and the way the letters group together to produce words. Turning, a turn of phrase or a trope, is not the perennial position an object occupies in space, but the way in which the ductus turns in order to produce the trajectory of a letter, and the inscription of that trajectory in space. Waves and wave propagations, effects and effects of effects, prior to becoming bodies. Den, the name of the signifier when it is invented, is such, being unable to coincide with any signified or referent, is connected with the letter and the presentation of discourse by means of the letter. Such as the scope of the clam secret that constitutes the complicated workings of THIRD-WORLDISM. Encore thematizes the first part of the trajectory very clearly, and moving from Aristotle to Democritus, you go from being and the jouissance of being with the whole kit and caboodle, from St. Thomas to Rousseau, and charity beginning at home to if we still have to keep the word being the being of signifierness lettre de la signifiance and its raison d'être, the jouissance of the body. What Aristotle wanted to know, and that paved the way for everything that followed in his wake, is what the jouissance of being is. Being, if people want me to use this term at all costs, the being that I oppose to that is the being of signifierness. And I fail to see in what sense I am stooping to the ideals of materialism. I say to the ideals because they're beyond its scope when I identify the reason for the being of signifierness in jouissance, the jouissance of the body. But, you see, a body hasn't seemed materialistic enough since Democritus. One has to find atoms in the whole 9 yards, not to mention sight, smell, and everything that follows therefrom. All that goes together. It's no accident that Aristotle occasionally quotes Democritus, even if he feigns disgust when he does so, for he relies on the latter's work. In fact, the atom is simply an element of flying signifierness, quite simply a Stoichean, my emphasis. The atom is an element of flying signifierness, the way mana is a floating signifier. They are signifiers, consistent with their being that isn't one, namely, their equivocal being as signifiers, their lack of identity a denial, if I dare say. For, as we eventually learn, what distinguishes the signifier is simply the fact that it is what all the others are not. It shows the presence of difference is such and nothing else. The second phase of the trajectory involves inscribing signifierness into the letter, and that is what lettered it, which is as incomprehensible as Aristotle as stupid does. That is why the den is necessary, the den whose consistency is not an isolated letter like that of Aristotelian propositional logic for all x but a line of letters made up of linked transformations, thus related instead to a small a as a phase of a trajectory and connected with any ductus to the extent that I understand what I'm saying here. If we somehow manage to think the real of the principle, there's no such thing as a sexual relationship in terms rendered illegible by Aristotle of the stowaway, the den, the stowaway of all ontology, it may actually turn out to be pretty funny. Absence, the name of the real as opposed to ontology, is connected with the impasses of logic. The sexual relationship can't be written and with the being allitra of the letter as pure wordplay. Of course, the absence of a sexual relationship is responsible for absence being the only course on the menu of the prompter's box. It is no less monotonous, it is even more monotonous, than sense. Except that what its monotonous eruption slips, symptoms, and interpretations have going for them is that they're funny. As compared with language itself, the unconscious means nothing if it does not mean that whatever I say, and wherever I'm positioned, even if I'm in a good position, 91 I don't know what I'm saying. Even if I don't know what I'm saying, I say that the cause of this is only to be sought in language itself. What I'm adding to Freud, I'm adding that the unconscious is structured like a language. Absence is located right within the relationship between performance and signifier, or the relationship between performance and signifier defines Lacanian sophistics. Now, if there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, we must see in what respect the jouissance of the body can serve a purpose here. Postscript in the form of a few propositions in the future perfect to respond to what follows. Proposition 1. Linguistrix linguistery will not have constituted any more of a Lacanian objection to logology than crookedness canelery has to philosophy, even less, in fact. Scholium 1. Anaphilosophy, the single name Badiou gives to the whole tradition from Gorgias to Wittgenstein, is characterized, as he himself emphasizes, by the detection of philosophical crookedness. Crookedness is always a matter of assuming that there is a meta-language, an assumption that determines the relationship to truth. 92. How could Platonic philosophy be an exception to this crooked relationship with truth when the philosopher king, even as a fictional construct, deals at least as much with meta-language as with mathematics? Proposition 2. The philosophy-anaphilosophy binary will have been a pure product of philosophy, one that philosophy will present as always already having a structuring effect. It is this effect of always already authorizing the always already of being or being, of truth or truth, of the real or the real that the other discourse, termed anaphilosophy by philosophy, reveals. Scholium 1. Philosophy will always already have won out over anaphilosophy, as soon as it dubs it anti and, in due course, Lacanian analysis, like Kantian critique or Hegelian dialectics, will only reinforce the binary. What I call logology rather than anaphilosophy abhors the binarism that always makes the other term fall on the other side, thereby ensuring the prominence of the first term, which will then be referred to as the philosophy pure being, is unbound multiplicity. 93. On the model of sense, everything that is outside sense or sense is either meaningful or senseless sensu inane, which is precisely what we must take our distance from. Logology makes use of illogical relativism, which is linked to both the dedicated, i.e., strategic, comparative of better for and the best way to inscribe plurality, including inscribing it politically. Scholium 2. Clearly, the requirement that logology and philosophy have in common stipulates absence of sense, with the difference between absence and nonsense being maintained. Isn't this difference demonstrated otherwise and much better by Democritus's den than by the formula? If the function of the formula is to make it understood that absence is absex sense linked to the impossibility of writing the sexual relationship, then the den will be the formula's stowaway, preventing one kind of monotony no contradiction from being replaced by another no sexual relationship. Indeed, it will then be said that a topology is deployed where it is the word that decides the matter. 8452. 94. Proposition 3. It will have been convenient, but no more than that, for philosophy to handle the man-woman difference by tacking it onto the philosophy and philosophy difference. Scholium 1. In particular, one won't only conclude that anaphilosophy the woman philosopher does no more than present philosophy with a new object plasticity, sophistics, etc., brought back to the center from the margins, which is tantamount to reinforcing the center's centrality and creating a beautiful history of 20th or 21st century philosophy. 95 Because it is not an object that is at issue but how an object is dealt with, and, more precisely, how the permeability of genres, including those of philosophy and anaphilosophy, is dealt with. And this has consequences for knowledge as well as for the mastery it confers. Scholium 2. Since we're in good company here, we've all read Lacan. It will be understood that a woman can be a man philosopher and that a man can be a woman philosopher. It remains to be seen whether philosophers and anaphilosophers, or philosophers and logologists, will understand in the same way that for a woman the word truth provokes a certain shiver and she will benefit much more than the man does from a certain culture of discourse translation modified.